Hello, it's Jorbs with another Spire Chat. I want to make these for all four characters. Silent felt like the simplest one to do first. Uh, I think tier lists have their place in conversations sometimes, but the main reason I'm using a tier list here is to try to communicate things about three different ways to win as Silent and Slay the Spire. So I'm not trying to say that the cards you're looking at right now are always the best cards to go for. What I'm trying to say is it might serve you to conceptualize Silent as being an attempt to build three different types of decks depending on the situation that you find yourself in. So the first kind of deck that I have up here, I would classify as card spam. And I would generally try to go for card spam on Silent if I got a good number of card removes early on and some pretty good card draw. So like 2 to 3 card removes in Act 1 plus an acrobatics and a dagger throw, or something like that. If that is in place, I'm thinking, okay, I can probably win this run pretty comfortably with card draw. The idea here is that we are using an engine of cards which draw cards, like acrobatics and calculated gamble and prepared plus reflex, and cards which generate energy, like tactician and concentrate. By the way, you should probably be trying to upgrade these cards. Paired with like adrenaline, which you only get to play once per fight, but it does both of those things, etc. Well laid plans sets you up for your next turn if it ever comes. And this engine is very powerful, can go infinite in certain fights, and in the fights where you can't just play cards with absolutely no consequence, like Time Eater or the Heart, having these cards in your deck allows you to easily win with anything at all that you find that is strong enough to win those fights, because you're able to find whatever it is that is strong enough to win those fights in your deck, and you're able to have enough energy to play it. So, the engine is like drawing cards and making energy, sure, but in order to get there, you're going to have to deal damage. You're not going to beat Gremlin Knob by just playing a bunch of acrobatics. You're going to need actual cards that kill Gremlin Knob. And so the best ways to deal damage in a deck like this, in my opinion, and with a note that when I'm talking about dealing damage, I'm mostly thinking about Act 1 and Act 2, because by the time that I'm in Act 3, I'm expecting my deck to have gotten to a point where it's very, very, very strong and can likely deal enough damage to kill enemies with just like 1 or 2 good cards. Anyway, best ways to deal damage: Dagger Throw, which is almost a part of the engine, really. It draws a card, it discards a card. So it works for drawing cards, and it works to discard Tactician and Reflex, and it deals 9 damage, so that's a good one. Eviscerate, which will regularly cost 0 off of you playing Acrobatics and Prepareds. Sneaky Strike will also effectively cost 0 a lot off of Acrobatics and Prepareds. Not quite as strong a card as Eviscerate, but also very strong. 1,000 Cuts is here. It probably shouldn't be this far up the list, but I just really like 1,000 Cuts, and this is an excellent deck shell for 1,000 Cuts to be in. You can win runs where 1,000 Cuts is pretty much your only damage. Blade Dance is here because Blade Dance just deals a ton of damage for 1 energy, basically. It also has a lot of synergies with different relics, like any strength gain, or a relic like Kunai. Something like Ink Bottle makes it draw half a card, etc. Corpse Explosion, just absolutely incredible damage. It deals so much damage for 2 energy. Crippling Cloud is great damage and block. There are lots of fights in the game where Crippling Cloud is good, and also it exhausts itself, so if you want to kind of slowly get toward an infinite engine, adding cards which exhaust themselves helps because you don't have to draw them more than once in a fight. Once you've played them, they're out of the way. You can just start playing Acrobatics and Tacticians. Endless Agony, same idea. Endless Agony exhausts itself when you play it after drawing it. Fast Knife deals a lot of damage for 1 energy. Terror deals tons and tons of damage, comboed with Eviscerate or Sneaky Strike, or even just the strikes that are in your starter deck. Choke is going to turn all of your card draw into damage. Finisher will combo with something like Blade Dance, or even just playing Neutralize several times or whatever. Generally, you're trying to play lots of cards, and so some of those can be attacks, and Finisher can end up being very good. Finisher is also just pickable on floor 1 and pretty good. And Die 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 is like AoE damage, which exhausts itself. So these are some good ways to deal damage. I'm not saying you can't use other ones. I'm just saying those are some good ones that I thought were good examples of types of damage cards that would fit well into this deck. All right, best ways to block. You can really block tons and tons and tons of different ways because you have this shell which lets you, for example, play 4 black backflips in the same turn. So you could have a footwork or 2 and just play lots of copies of backflip plus, perhaps. Or you could have a malaise and you could easily draw to that on turn 1 or 2 and play it for a lot of energy against the Heart or Time Eater or Awakened one and trivialize that fight. Piercing Whale, you're going to be able to access on the turns where you get multi-attacked. Wraith Form is just incredible and often comboed with the Duplication Potion. 6 turns of Intangible is long enough to kill anything in the game with a deck like this. Neutralizes in your deck anyway and costs 0, so you're going to be able to draw it and play it a lot. Survivor is in your deck anyway and lets you discard Tactician Reflex, so that card's like generally okay. You're generally not going to be removing it over the course of a run anyway. And then, like, once you have this stuff going on, you can pretty much always, as Silent, be looking out for combo potential. So here I have Nightmare, Setup, Catalyst, and Bouncing Flask. Of these 4 cards, I would say that Setup is much less relevant than the other 3, but you can keep an eye out for Setup as a bit of additional help for your engine. But for the most part here, it's like you want to Nightmare Catalyst and have some sort of poison application going on. If you can put that together, you often get to stop worrying about blocking because enemies will just die very, very, very quickly. And you're going to be able to have access to that on turn 1 or 2, so enemies will start dying very, very quickly, very, very soon into the fight. A bunch of cards here which don't synergize directly with the plan, which doesn't mean you should never take them. It doesn't mean that they have no value. It doesn't mean that they're bad cards. It just means that I don't think it's worth talking about them with regards to building a deck that has this as its goal. That doesn't mean that you like can't win runs off of a card like Accuracy by any stretch of the imagination. It doesn't even mean that Accuracy won't sometimes be really good in a deck like this. If you start out your damage with a couple of Blade Dances, Accuracy may be an excellent card to add for an upcoming boss fight, or even just to get your damage over the top against elites and even hallway fights. So, like, don't pretend these cards don't exist when you're trying to play like this. I'm just putting them there because they don't fit conceptually with the rest of what the deck is doing. You'll take them sometimes if you're trying to win as much as possible while building a deck like this, but you'll do it because you have to solve some sort of problem going on, like that you don't have enough damage for a boss fight that's coming up or something like that. And I thought these cards at the bottom were worth mentioning, which doesn't mean that they are good or bad in particular. I just thought the way that they interact with the strategy was interesting, and so I wanted to talk about them in particular. So first off, tools of the trade. You might think, well, this is a deck that has Tactician and Reflex. Surely tools of the trade, letting me discard cards every turn would be good. The reason that tools of the trade isn't part of the core engine for me is that it doesn't do anything until next turn. And if you are building a deck like this successfully, you will very, very commonly build a deck that doesn't care very much about next turn because it can do everything this turn. So Tools of the Trade is just a little slow for a deck like this. And often when I'm building a deck like this, I will be looking at a Tools of Trade and thinking, like, is my deck slow enough that I need this? Or can my deck be fast enough that I can just skip it? Because taking what is essentially a slimed on turn 1 does slow your deck down quite a lot on turn 1, and turn 1 is the first turn of every fight, so it does matter quite a bit what happens on turn 1. Blurs here, I didn't put Blur in the best ways to block, but there will often be times where Blur is a very good block card. I just don't think that Blur is like part of the identity of a deck like this to me, but it is still often a very powerful card. It's going to be a strong card when paired with like good dexterity generation, and when you have like some big turns, but not all of your turns really go off. So basically, if the deck isn't functioning fully, Blur can be a little bit more valuable. There will also, I have had runs with decks like this where I have like an Incense Burner, which makes me intangible 1 turn out of 6, and I don't generate enough block to be block positive on any turn other than that. And so I've had to win by generating like 400 block with a very, very, very long sequence of cards on the turn while I'm intangible, so I'm only taking 1 damage from the Beat of Death, and then playing Blur 6 times so the block doesn't go away until the fight's over. So like Blur is a powerful effect. I wouldn't say that it usually fits into a deck like this, but it definitely can be used to good effect. Deflect is here. You might think with a ton of card draw, Deflect is a really sensible way to block. The problem is that it doesn't draw a card, and your ability to put cards into your deck which don't draw a card is pretty limited when you're doing this. You're going to be slowing yourself down a ton. So if you're really, really, really overachieving on card draw and underachieving on energy generation, then Deflect is a decent add to the deck. But it would generally be better, I would say, to just like find a tactician or a concentrate or something to add to the deck instead. And then you'll have enough energy to just play a backflip instead of a deflect. And your backflip draws cards. So your deck has gotten better instead of, I would say, a little bit slower and worse by adding a deflect. Note that making your deck worse is like conceptually, I don't mean that it's making you less likely to win the run, because sometimes when you add a deflect, you just have to not die, which like practically speaking makes your deck better right now. I'm just saying like conceptually for how I'm thinking of this deck, deflect is not doing great. It's not quite aligned with the deck's goals. Grand Finale is here. The thing about Grand Finale is it's going to be pretty unusual for a deck to make better use of Grand Finale than a deck like this one does. Like the other way that you can make better use of Grand Finale is there's some really weird stuff with tons of card removes, but then there's also Runic Pyramid. Runic Pyramid can make pretty good use of Grand Finale. That said, Eviscerate is just so strong, and Sneaky Strike is so strong that you don't usually even need Grand Finale, and it is an inconsistent card, which is hard to make consistent use of. And so, generally speaking, I'm skipping Grand Finale and taking other damage cards, which I can play more freely. Even though it's really sweet when Grand Finale comes off, you genuinely do not need to bend over backwards to make Grand Finale come off most of the time, because your other cards are high enough quality that there just isn't that much upside to doing all of that extra work. Alchemize is here. Alchemize is a really good card, and I would not generally be skipping it unless there was a different card that was better somehow, but it just didn't really feel like it fit into any of the other categories, so I put it down here. It's not like it's not really a part of the identity of this deck. It's just such a good silent card that you're going to take it, probably. Bullet Time is here. Bullet Time can fit into a deck like this, but it turns it into a very different sort of deck. I think I'm going to talk about that sort of deck next, actually. But Bullet Time's a really interesting card, which, if you pick up a Bullet Time early in the run, it gives you a lot of flexibility. It can be useful in a deck like this. It doesn't let you go infinite, because when you play it, you can't draw any more cards this turn. But lets you go like big enough each turn. Like you'll play a bunch of cards to draw cards and then play Bullet Time and get to play 8 cards or whatever and be good. I'm working. I'm working, cat. So yeah, I just wanted to put that here and mention that. You definitely can end up doing stuff with Bullet Time. I could talk about the other cards like Noxious Fumes and things like that too, but I just can't talk about every single card, right? But there are lots of ways in which lots of Silence card pool can be useful. In fact, several of the cards that are in these don't synergize directly with plan. I would be regularly taking, even if I was aiming to build a deck like this. Like Leg Sweep or Predator or Masterful Stab. These are all cards that I would very likely be taking in Act 1, Backstab as well, stuff like that. Some of these scaling powers I might take if my deck needed a little bit more scaling, etc. Envenom's here, worth mentioning, especially if you get a Snecko Skull. Envenom can just turn into very, very, very good damage, but in general, without other things going on, like you having a preponderance of energy and nothing great to spend it on, for example, or a number of Blade Dances and Eviscerates to proc it lots of times per turn or something like that, Envenom's generally going to be a skip for me. But like, I'm always kind of on the lookout with Envenom. Is it a good moment for Envenom? If it is, I'll go for it. My notes on card spam that I made before I did all of that spiel. This relies on quickly approaching equal card positive status to cards in deck and energy positive to the cost of cycling through the cards in deck. So what I mean by that is if you look at acrobatics, it draws 3 cards and it only takes 1 card to play it, right? So you could think of this as a +2. Backflip's a +1. Escape plan is neutral. Prepared plus you could think of as a +1 because it draws 2 cards. There's discard going on with acrobatics and prepared, but hopefully we're discarding tactician and reflex. Reflex is itself plus cards when discarded. Calculated gamble we can think of as plus cards, kind of. Adrenaline's going to be +1 card. Once you get to a point where you have like +10 card draw in your card draw cards, you'll be able to have like 6 to 8 dead cards. Some of those are going to be your basics that you didn't get to remove, and the rest are going to be things like eviscerate, hopefully, cards which are actually good and kill things for you. Some of them may be cards that get out of the way, like a footwork. So if you have +10 on your card draw and then like 8 dead cards which you can't exhaust, and then 4 cards like footwork where like the first time through your deck, yeah, you're going to have to draw them and you'll be a bit slower, but then once you've actually played them, you're in a point where you're card draw positive. That's fine. Slows you down a little bit, but maybe necessary. And then you also want to be energy positive. So if I need to get to +10 with Acrobatics Plus and Prepared Plus, I probably need to play 3 Acro Pluses and a Prepared Plus, which costs 3 energies. So I'm going to be trying to discard 2 Tacticians while I do that, or a Tactician and I concentrate discarding a Reflex or something like that. And that's just a way of thinking about, am I in a situation where my deck is actually getting off the ground and doing the thing that I'm trying to build? Practically speaking, in order to do that, you're usually going to like take early acrobatics and dagger throw and get things like eviscerate and sneaky strike, get 3 good card removes in Act 1 maybe. And then once your card draw is going, you can think about adding energy generation then. If you have a deck with really bad card draw, like having a tactician that is unupgraded in it is kind of atrocious. But if you have a deck that's heading this direction, taking an unupgraded tactician with the plan to upgrade it later and make a ton of use of it over the run is very appealing. And yeah, I already mentioned that you're not going to win with the engine on its own. You're going to add some sort of card that does something to the engine, or maybe a few different ones, and play those a lot. So that is one way. God, that took me 18 minutes. Anyway, that is one way when it's silent. Here's a different way. I would call this a value silent deck. I think this is actually what most newer players of the game are going to aim toward, because the idea here is just that you have started off adding cards that are better than your starter deck to your deck, and then you just keep doing it, and you hope that you get to a point where you're strong enough to win the fights at the end of the game. And with good play, you usually can. I would say that trying to play a value deck is a lot harder, actually, than trying to play a card spam deck, which might surprise you, but once you've learned what it's like to play a deck that is positive card draw and positive energy generation, the rest of it kind of souls itself because you have positive card draw and positive energy generation, so you can really just do whatever you want. You'll notice that, like, well, Time Eater is a little bit tricky, so I'm going to take a Malaise, and I'm going to take a Catalyst. And you'll notice, like, well, the Heartbeat of Death hits me pretty bad, so I'm going to take an Afterimage and a Wraith form, and then you'll win. Whereas with a value deck, you really have to have a plan for pretty much every turn in the entire game, and different turns are going to demand different things of you. The enablers here, the concept here is that you're going to probably take energy boss relics. So when I'm building a card spam deck, I'm often skipping energy boss relics. Runic Pyramid's probably the most appealing, but things like Empty Cage and Astrolabe and Pandora's Box are really good as well. Our cards can generate energy for us, so we don't need energy from our boss relics, and also we end fights in very few turns with card spam, and so generating 1 energy per turn isn't that exciting. With a value silent deck, we don't expect to end fights in very few turns. We expect the fights to probably last quite a while. And so energy per turn from boss relics is a lot more appealing. Also, a lot of the identity of our deck is about making a hand of like 5 to 10 cards, depending on how much card draw we draw each turn, do a lot. And one way to do that is to make sure that we have like 4 or 5 energy to actually play the cards in it. So we're going to be taking boss relics that give energy quite a bit more. And we're going to be taking powers that make it so the cards that we play do more. We're going to be taking nightmares so we can play more of those powers like footwork and afterimage. We're going to be playing well-laid plans so that we can have the cards that do something big on the right turns. Something like a piercing whale really wants to be played on a turn where we're getting attacked multiple times, for example. So if you draw it on a turn where you're only getting attacked one time, you want to be able to hold that with well-laid plans instead of playing it on the turn where it's worse. I have Noxious Fumes in here as a value enabler just because it is a way to deal a lot of damage over time. I like Noxious Fumes quite a bit in decks like this, although I do not think that it is the best card possible for something like the Gremlin Nob fight, for example. And I don't I don't think that my opinion that it is not as controversial or particularly hard to understand. It deals damage in a way that is slow, but it does consistently deal damage over time, and that damage ramps up as the fight continues. And that's kind of what a deck like this is trying to do, because as you get to late game in Slay the Spire, the fights, the enemies that you're fighting against tend to be buffing themselves, gaining more strength over time, putting more statuses in your deck over time, doing nasty things to you as the fight goes on. And so if you're going to stay in fights for a long time against them, you either want to break the game or you want to make sure that you're getting stronger over time as well. Best ways to deal damage. This shares a lot with the card spam section of the silent chat that I'm doing here, just because I genuinely think that the discard synergies on silent are very, very, very strong. So we've got Dagger Throw, Eviscerate, Sneaky Strike here. You still want acrobatics. You still want prepared. They're just not as central to the identity of the deck. This kind of silent build can also take Snecko Eye, by the way. Bullet Time is a pretty good enabler of Snecko Eye, and a lot of our value cards are like singular cards that do a lot, because we can't guarantee that we draw every card in our deck every turn, so we want to make sure that we're drawing cards that do quite a lot. So there are also some cards here that are about doing stuff next turn, because next turn is very much a thing. Tools of the Trade is there in value enablers. Phantasmal Killer is here as a good way to deal damage. Predator is here. Drawing 2 cards next turn is often very powerful if you care about next turn, etc., etc., etc. Best ways to block. Very similar to... It isn't, actually. Anyway, best ways to block. I have a lot of 1-cost block cards that scale with dexterity here, because often that is the most accessible way for silent to block if you're not doing something broken. Malaise is obviously up there in value enablers. Wraithform is there in combo potential to look out for. So those really broken cards are there as well for sure. But if you're looking at commons and uncommons, cards like Backflip and Leg Sweep and Dodge and Roll are kind of the honest silence way to get it done. And those are the cards that you're likely to be relying on just because you're not going to get offered enough of the broken cards to use the broken cards in every run of Slay the Spire that you play. Best ways to accelerate. Accelerating out your cards is still very important. Drawing cards, generating energy is quite nice. So we're still interested in cards like Tactician and Reflex and Acrobatics and Prepared and Calculated Gamble, and definitely Adrenaline. But they're not central to the identity of the deck. We might be playing 1 or 2 of those per turn instead of trying to play 300 of them per turn. And then combo potential to look out for. You're always looking for Wraithform and Catalyst on silent. If you're not, I don't understand what's going on. those cards are just very, very strong. And then I have a bunch of cards down here, which I don't think particularly synergize with the plan. That doesn't mean that you can't use them. Again, sometimes they will be very good. Especially in Act 1, you're going to want to make sure that you're taking damage commons and uncommons so that you can get through elite fights. So you shouldn't be like skipping these if they are the damage cards that are offered to you in Act 1 and you need to get ready for an elite fight. You will often need some scaling for boss fights, and you're going to have to take the scaling that is offered to you instead of being, greedy and looking for exactly the right scaling for the deck that you're trying to build and then dying because you don't find it, etc., etc., etc. All right, so that's value. The notes that I had on this piercing whale, I think, is really important. To you need to be able to leverage cards which are easily available, which do very, very, very powerful things on the hard turns of the game. And so when the heart attacks you for like 6 times 15 and you have to block 90 damage, yeah, you could find a way to do that with like leg sweeps and dodge and rolls and blurs and enough dexterity and stuff, but Piercing Whale actually does that for 1 energy. So Piercing Whale's a real star, I would say, in Silent's card pool in terms of commons, which can just be very unfair late game. Practically, I think trying to win like this is incredibly nuanced, and often you'll win or lose based on things like which potion you choose to buy at a store, or whether you use or save a potion in a particular fight, or whether you add 1 more damage card or 1 more block card to your deck. I would say in general that people take too many damage cards and not enough block cards. In general, just like based on what I've seen players do, what I've seen of people's decks. Generally speaking, if your deck doesn't have too many bad cards in it, you don't need tons and tons and tons of damage cards. And generally speaking, it is worse to have a turn of Slay the Spire where you can't block than it is to have a turn of Slay the Spire where you can't deal damage. Which means just because of the fact that your deck is getting shuffled and you're only drawing 5 to 10 cards per turn, we'll say, you are going to want to make sure that you have a good density of block cards to try to protect yourself from those turns in general. We're talking in generalities here for a game which is highly specific, and small things like which relics you have or how much health you have or which potions you have can change this tremendously. Yeah. All right. The third type of silent deck that I want to talk about is very simple to talk about. You just win top 6 cards, often by playing them on turn 1. This is one of the ways that Silent can just be incredibly, incredibly broken. You can also fit this core of cards, this like combo of cards, into other shells of Silent decks and pair it with something like a Liquid Memories or a Well-Laid Plans, or just a little bit of luck to get your combo off in the fights that matter fast enough to win. And the idea here is basically just to play Burst, Bouncing Flask, and Catalyst while not dying because you are intangible from Wraith form. If you have Apparitions from the Act 2 event, that helps you stay alive a little bit longer. Obviously, you can have other things going on in the deck that are good too. You don't have to not have anything else going on. But the most broken that Silent decks ever feel for me is when I just apply 200 poison to the heart on turn 1 of the heart fight and then press end turn 4 times with Wraith form in play, and it dies. And it's not actually that hard for Silent to do that. The card pool allows it. The cards that let you do it are good on their own, so you're happy to take them a lot of the time, even if you're doing something else, and then you can kind of oops into the combo being there. And I just wanted to make this an entire thing to itself to make sure that you are thinking about it, because there are a lot of runs which can be won very easily if you just recognize that you're like 3/4 of the way to being able to do this and buy the right card in the shop, and all of a sudden you have it all put together. And even though before your deck was based around like 2 blade dances and an accuracy, and that's how you were dealing damage, now you are dealing damage by applying 3,000 poison on turn 2, which is arguably better. So those are 3 kind of core formulations of silent strategy, which you can use to win your runs of Slay the Spire. And generally speaking, I would say that if you don't have a strong Act 1, you're probably going to be looking to put together some value stuff. If you do have a very strong Act 1, I would be leaning more toward putting together card spam stuff. And then basically anytime you're doing anything as a silent player, if you have access to this combo kill based on the cards you're offered, maybe a lucky transform or an Ari in a shop or something like that, go for it because it is extremely, extremely strong. And you can fit this type of damage into a variety of block structures. Like you can block with footworks and backflips while applying 200 poison to things. That's okay. You don't have to use Great Form. It's just often you will be fast enough that you can. Actually, often like it's hard to kill Awakened One in particular with poison because Awakened One cleanses all poison at the end of phase 1 and you can't skip phase 2. Against Time Eater, you just skip phase 2 and Time Eater dies with her cleansing poison, no problem at all. But against Awakened One, the poison actually does get cleansed. So often a deck like this will want to have the ability to like play like a pretty normal deck against Awakened One in particular. There are other ways to get around it. But yeah, that's a little very brief crash course in Silent to give you some food for thought. I don't think that having watched this, you should expect to be able to play Silent perfectly, but I hope that it gave you some ideas and some structure for thinking about the character. All right. Bye bye.